I've worked the graveyard shift at our small town diner for years. The hours are long, the tips are okay, and the customers are mostly truckers or night owls looking for a hot meal. But there was one week, just one, that's been burned into my memory forever. It started with a white van. I first noticed it parked across the street when I came in for my shift one night. At first, I didn't think much of it. Lots of people park there. But this van, it was different. The headlights were on, shining directly into the diner windows. It sat there for hours, but no one ever got out. On the second night, the van was there again, same spot, same headlights. I asked my coworker, Gina, if she noticed it too, and she just shrugged. Probably someone waiting for a ride, she said, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The longer I stared at the van, the more my stomach churned. By the third night, I couldn't ignore the unease. After the dinner rush, the diner was practically empty. The van was still there, its headlights cutting through the darkness. I decided to step outside for a smoke, hoping to shake the feeling of being watched. That's when I noticed the van's sliding door. It was slightly open, just enough to see the black void inside. I froze. My heart started pounding as I scanned the area. The parking lot was empty, and the street was silent except for the hum of the diner's neon sign. I felt exposed like a deer in a hunter's sights. I dropped my cigarette and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. Gina noticed my pale face and asked what was wrong. When I told her, she laughed it off. "You're paranoid. Probably some weirdo sleeping in their van." But her laughter didn't calm me. If anything, it made me more certain that something wasn't right. The next night, things got worse. Around midnight, I had to take the trash out to the dumpster behind the diner. The alley was dimly lit, and the dumpster reeked like it always did. I was halfway there when I heard the soft crunch of gravel behind me. I whipped around, but no one was there. My pulse was racing as I scanned the lot, my eyes darting to the shadows. That's when I saw it. The white van had moved. It was now parked at the edge of the alley, its headlights off. I bolted back inside, slamming the door behind me. "Someone's out there," I shouted to Gina. She grabbed a kitchen knife and went to check the back door. But by the time she got there, the van was gone. That was the last straw. I told the diner's manager about the van and begged to switch to a different shift. He brushed me off, saying I was probably overreacting. But the following night, as I was leaving after my shift, the van was parked at the edge of the lot, its headlights off again. This time, I didn't wait to see what would happen. I got in my car and floored it, keeping my eyes on the rearview mirror the entire way home. The van didn't follow me, but the unease stayed. A few weeks later, I heard on the news that a woman working the night shift at a diner 2 towns over had been abducted. Witnesses reported seeing a white van in the area. I don't work the graveyard shift anymore, and every time I see a white van, my chest tightens. I can't help but think of how close I might have come to being a headline myself. Working the night shift at a diner can be monotonous, especially in a small town like ours. The hours are long, and customers are few and far between once it gets late. That Thursday night started off like any other, quiet, with only the sound of the coffee machine and the occasional hum of a car passing by. It was around 10 p.m. when the doorbell chimed and a man walked in. He looked ordinary enough, the kind of person you wouldn't glance at twice. Mid-40s, a bit scruffy, wearing a faded hoodie and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He took a seat at the counter and spent a little too long studying the menu. When I asked him if he wanted coffee, he nodded and said yes. His voice was soft, almost too quiet for me to hear. After a moment, he ordered a burger and fries to go. As I rang him up, I noticed his hands were shaking slightly when he passed me a 20. He wasn't nervous exactly, but something about his demeanor felt strange. While I was putting his order together, I caught him glancing around the diner, his eyes lingering on the kitchen and then on the back door. He wasn't eating or looking at his phone like most customers do, just staring, like he was taking everything in. When the food was ready, I placed the bag in front of him. He muttered something about needing to use the restroom and walked off down the hallway. I assumed he'd be back in a couple of minutes, so I busied myself wiping down the counter and refilling the salt shakers. But he didn't come back. I waited for nearly 20 minutes, and by the time I went to check the hallway, it was empty. The bathroom door was open, the light off. He was gone. His food sat there on the counter, untouched. I thought maybe he'd had an emergency or forgotten something in his car, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. When I went to throw out the bag, I saw a napkin folded neatly next to it. I picked it up, thinking it was trash, but there was writing on it: "Leave before midnight." The words stopped me in my tracks. Midnight was only a few minutes away. I wasn't sure if it was a joke or if someone was trying to mess with me, but it didn't feel funny. I tossed the napkin in the trash and tried to focus on cleaning up the diner. At 12:15, the bell over the door chimed again. I looked up, expecting to see someone walk in, but the doorway was empty. The door itself was slightly open, swaying gently like someone had just left. I stepped around the counter to close it, and that's when I noticed movement at the edge of the parking lot. There, just beyond the reach of the streetlights, was the man from earlier. He was standing by the trees, barely visible in the shadows, but I could tell he was watching me. I didn't stand there long. I locked the door and went back to the counter, pretending to stay calm, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking as I cleaned up. When I looked out the window again, he was gone. The rest of the shift dragged on. When my replacement came in the next morning, I told her about the man, but she just laughed and said I was probably overthinking it. I didn't feel like arguing, so I left. The next day, I came in early to talk to my boss about what happened. He brushed it off, saying it was probably just a drifter passing through. But when I went to grab something from the fridge, I noticed the bag of food was gone. I knew I hadn't thrown it away. Then I found another napkin tucked behind the register. It had a single word written on it: soon. That was the last night shift I ever worked. I traded shifts with someone else and started working during the day. But sometimes when I drive past the diner at night, I glance at the parking lot, half expecting to see him standing there. Closing shifts at the diner are always the longest. By the time it's just me and Gina, the kitchen's quiet, and the place feels like it belongs to another world. There's a certain stillness to the late hours, broken only by the occasional customer wandering in. That stillness, it's comforting most nights, but not that night. It was just after 1 a.m., and we were prepping to close. Gina was finishing up in the kitchen, and I was wiping down the tables in the dining area. That's when the bell above the door jingled and a man walked in. He was tall, wearing a faded jacket and a beanie pulled low over his forehead. His face was unshaven, and his eyes looked sunken, like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't say a word, just walked to a booth near the back and sat down. I grabbed a menu and approached him, putting on my best polite smile. "Good evening. Can I get you something to drink while you decide?" He didn't look at me right away. Instead, his gaze drifted toward the clock on the wall. Finally, he mumbled, "Coffee. Black." I nodded, trying not to let his strange demeanor get to me. People are odd sometimes, especially at night. I brought him his coffee and he didn't say thank you, just stared at the steam rising from the cup. When I returned to the counter, Gina peeked out from the kitchen. "What's his deal?" she asked. "Don't know, he just ordered coffee," I said, keeping my voice low. The man stayed there for a while, not drinking his coffee, not eating, just sitting. Occasionally he'd glance at the clock or toward the front door like he was waiting for something or someone. I couldn't help but keep an eye on him. About 20 minutes later, he stood up abruptly, leaving the coffee untouched. He walked toward the door, and I let out a quiet breath of relief, thinking he was leaving. But instead of stepping outside, he stopped at the door and turned the lock. That was when my stomach tightened. I walked up to him, trying to stay calm. "Sir, you can't lock the door. We're still open." He turned to face me, his eyes sharp and focused now. "You should lock it, for your own safety." I froze for a second, unsure how to respond. Why would we need to lock the door? He didn't answer. Instead, he walked back to his booth, sat down, and folded his hands on the table, staring out the window. I glanced back at Gina, who was standing behind the counter now, gripping a knife from the kitchen. I could tell she was as unnerved as I was. Minutes passed, and nothing happened. The man just sat there. Every time I glanced at him, he was looking out the window, completely still. Finally, Gina whispered, "I'm calling the cops." She stepped into the back to make the call, and I stayed near the counter, keeping an eye on the man. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. When Gina came back, she whispered, "They're on their way." But before the police could arrive, the man stood up again and walked toward the door. This time, he unlocked it and stepped outside. I hurried over to lock it again, but as I turned the latch, I noticed something outside. Another man was standing at the edge of the parking lot, watching the diner. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie, and his face was obscured by shadows. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there. The first man walked toward him, and the two exchanged a few words I couldn't hear. Then they both disappeared into the night. The police showed up a few minutes later, but by then, both men were long gone. They took our statements and checked the area, but they didn't find anything. That was the last time I worked a closing shift. To this day, I wonder what those men were planning. What might have happened if the stranger hadn't told us to lock the door? And every time I think about it, I get this uneasy feeling that whatever it was, we were just seconds away from finding out.